TheDaak Baithak to our 19th Baithak. TheDaak began in 2023 as a book review journal, publishing original reviews across disciplines and genres. From the start, we sought to reimagine the form of the book review itself, encouraging writing that moves beyond summary to engage deeply, reflectively, and creatively with the world a book opens up. Over time, we grew into a biannual academic journal that now includes reviews, explainers, commentaries, and research essays. Each issue is built around a central theme, bringing together diverse voices that explore the intersections across social sciences. Our double blind peer review process ensures rigor, while our editorial approach values accessibility and creative thought. Beyond the journal, TheDaak has grown into a vibrant collective. Through our reading groups, we meet every month to discuss a shared book, discovering new perspectives through conversation. Through TheDaak Weekly, we publish personal essays, topical reflections, and explainers that extend our conversations into the present moment. TheDaak Baithak is our humble attempt to huddle around a small gathering of scholars, writers, students from different fields to present ideas and initiate dialogue, bringing critical conversations to life. Our session today is titled Surface Tensions, Potholes, and the Embodied Politics of Driving in Urban India. Our speaker today is Dr. Sneha Annavarupu. Dr. Sneha is an assistant professor of sociology at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and the South Asian Studies program at the National University of Singapore. Her research interests center around the politics of transportation, infrastructure, class relations, and gender in contemporary Indian cities. Our discussants for today are Dr. Ishan Shahi, an urban studies scholar, and Vedal, a student pursuing political science at Hindu College, University of Delhi. Dr. Sneha, the format is usually that the speaker shares their ideas or their presentation for 25 to 30 minutes. You can take longer if needed, post which our discussants will share their insights or any questions. And once you can take all the questions and answer them, and post which the floor is then open to the participants and everybody in the meeting to share their questions or any ideas that they have. We can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you so much to the organizers at TheDaak for this invitation. It's I know we've been sort of planning it for a while, and I was not feeling too well 2 weeks ago when I think it was originally proposed that we do it. I'm still not at the best of my health, so I hope I'm audible and clear enough. But yeah, thanks a lot. This is a really great honor I love talking to students who are interested in sociology, anthropology, questions of politics, power, and privilege in India. And I learn so much more every time I present my work in front of an audience in India. So it's great. I mean, this paper has been published, and I think it was also circulated as part of this. So I'll keep in mind the feedback for future work for sure. So don't hold back just because it's been published. I'll start with a bit of the overview for today. I'll speak a little bit about the book project that this particular paper is a part of, so that it gives you an idea of what I'm really working on in the larger context. Then we'll talk about the ethnographic research behind this, for which I invite a lot of questions in the Q&A, because I'm not really going very deep into it, what it means to be doing fieldwork on a topic like driving. But also, how do we reckon with social positionality, questions of privilege, questions of access, but also the risks of fieldwork. So I invite questions on fieldwork generally. I love talking about ethnography. Then we'll talk about potholes, and then finally, I guess, the Q&A and the moderator discussions, which I'm really thrilled to be a part of. So yeah, the book project is tentatively titled On the Move, The Politics of Driving in Urban India. I've been far too slow at writing this book, but it is in the making, and hopefully some version of it will appear at some point. I think I just got, all right. So the book is essentially trying to scratch the surface of this popular stereotype of the Indian road or the Indian driver, right? Like this notion of there being a disobedient, rule-breaking, almost like smugly competitive Indian driver on the road, and all these stereotypes that actually populate public discourse, both locally and globally, about Indian driving. So I'm trying to get behind that stereotype to understand really what are the kinds of experiences of driving in India and how are they narrativized in public sphere, right? Like how are people commenting on traffic, on potholes, on the experience of driving in an Indian metropolis, alongside how they're making sense of the informal norms of social interaction in traffic, how are people making sense of what's a bad driver, what's a good driver, all these sorts of questions were actually why I started looking at this topic to begin with, right? And all this, of course, happening in the context of a larger conversation, which is much more medicalized in nature, which is on road safety, and trying to really understand what is the government doing to, put an end to the sort of carnage on Indian roads, but also like how do we make Indian roads safer, right? So there's so much more conversation around road safety, and so all of these things are sort of coming together as I'm doing field work on a broad topic of driving, right? Like I'm also trying to figure out what exactly am I studying, and all of these things were happening at the same time. And I also began to notice how there's a pedagogical element to policing in India, where they're trying to like make people follow traffic rules by saying things like, again, law breaking is easy, nation building is tough. So there's a pedagogical and pastoral element of policing when it comes to traffic, right? There are material interventions, like there are speed bumps, there are medians, there are dividers, there are bollards, all these things that are also like built environmental infrastructure interventions to make people follow rules, right? And there are new technological interventions that are amping up the punitive power of the police in order to identify and, say, issue challans or tickets, right? So all of these technological modernization factors are also playing into the same question of how do we make people follow traffic rules, and how do these interventions then shape the experience of driving in India, right? And again, all this happening in the backdrop of rapid population growth in a city like Hyderabad, for instance, but also the growth of the number of registered vehicles, right? And other scholars have written about how automobility or motorization has become the driving force of urban planning, with pedestrians, for instance, being written out of urban plans, right? And it's all being geared towards the motor vehicle and the motoring body per se. So the book sort of examines the structural, material, and infrastructural conditions of driving and the regulation of driving in one particular city in India, that's Hyderabad. And I can talk a little more about why Hyderabad in a bit. But the book essentially is trying to show how driving is not just about transportation and movement. It's actually about state-citizen relations. It's about urban inequality. It's about the frustrations and the fantasies of a post-colonial nation, right? So as of now, the book is sort of laid out in this way. In the first chapter, I discuss the figure of the unruly driver, and I show that it's actually not a stable figure. There's no one figure that becomes the unruly driver. It depends on the context, depends on gender, class, caste, religion, age, what have you, right? The type of vehicle you're driving and so on. But I also look at what this idea of an expert driver really is in a city like Hyderabad. Who is the expert driver, right? So that's the first chapter. The second one is on policing and traffic policing, as I discussed briefly. The third one is on driving licenses. So the question I'm trying to answer in this chapter is what happens when there is bribery and brokerage at the point of turning, people into drivers, like licensed drivers. So how does corruption shape people's relationship to driving itself? Then, in the fourth chapter, which you will hear a little bit about today, is on potholes and how the bumpiness of the road actually shapes people's relationships to the state, right? And the fifth one is on the complete opposite, which is on actually speed. And so I'm looking at flyovers, expressways, ring roads, and how speed is like an area of negotiation between the state and its citizens, particularly motorists, right? So this is a kind of broad project. And the fieldwork for this, I primarily did as part of my PhD fieldwork, and I did a bulk of it between 2017 and 2020 before COVID hit. And then subsequently, I moved to Singapore, and I've sort of been doing shorter visits till 22. And the perks of ethnography, it's pretty flexible, so I'm able to sort of manage with shorter trips. But we can also talk about what it's like to do short visits versus a long-term immersive sort of project. So yeah, like much ethnography, mine was also based on observations, field notes, on semi-structured interviews. A lot of cab ride-alongs, for instance, became a space where I was talking to drivers on the go, on the move. Participant observation. So I was also learning to drive as part of this field work, which was an interesting experience. I'll speak a little bit about it in a bit. And interpretive analysis of news media. So I was looking at historical reportage on this issue of road safety, particularly. But also I was looking at contemporary news reports around the same in the city of Hyderabad in particular. So yeah, as I said earlier, I spent some time with traffic police. I was able to follow them on their, I picked a couple of police stations, 3 police stations to be precise, and 2 counseling centers in the city, and I followed police officials on their everyday duty, as to the best of my capacity and to the best that they would actually allow me, right? But I was able to attend some interesting procedures like police training facilities. I was able to attend road safety workshops for IPS officers, so on and so forth. There was a lot of, again, access, which was linked to my positionality in the city of Hyderabad, where I had friends whose parents were IPS officers. And again, we'll talk a little more about that during Q&A. I'll be happy to answer more questions about it. Then the other big component of this fieldwork was motorists. So I was doing a lot of interviews with auto rickshaw drivers, cab drivers, two-wheeler riders, and car drivers. And as I said earlier, I myself learned how to drive at a motor driving school, because I didn't actually drive before this project, and I still don't actually really enjoy driving, but I had to go through the process of learning to drive from scratch, which was really great because it gave me a sense of how people at the early stage of driving pick up how to drive, right? What are the kinds of informal advice that driving instructors, for instance, are giving motorists to navigate Indian roads, particularly. Then I also spent some time just interviewing and hanging out with volunteers of local NGOs that are working on road safety in the city. So this is, I was participating in some road safety awareness programs during Road Safety Week. For that in 2018 and 2019. And yeah, then I was just keeping an eye out on interesting things that were happening on social media, things that were getting discussed by my interlocutors, particularly things that they would send me, things that they had opinions about. So it wasn't really a computational sociology sort of big data analysis, but it was just paying attention to how digital media was circulating amongst my interlocutors. What were they actually interested in talking about, right? Which viral video were they fascinated by? Which tweet did they find very funny? Stuff like that. All right, so that's the kind of backdrop of the project. And I'll talk about this particular aspect of the book, which is Potholes, which was recently published in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. Just an FYI, and something I tell my students as well, things get published and it just seems like, it just came out. This was after a lot of revisions, after a lot of back-breaking critical feedback. Many a time I just wanted to give up on the paper. It's hard. Things take a long time. And so this was in the works I sent it to IJA last year, sometime in 24, but it's been in the works for a long time. And I've actually given several versions of the same talk based on this data, just to say that, these things take time. And I think it's very easy to go on LinkedIn and just feel like, oh, wow, people are publishing so much. But actually, it's quite, there's a lot of disappointment along the way. This was also sent to another journal that rejected it immediately. So, there's like always these backstories that I think should be brought to light when we talk about publication and research and stuff like that. Anyway, I'll start with an ethnographic vignette. I'm sure some of you read the paper, so I'm sorry, some of it is going to be repetitive, but I'm just assuming that not everybody had the chance to read it. And so I'll just read out my favorite vignette, which I always start with, which I think sets the stage pretty well. And I'll not read out the whole paper, but I'll pick parts of it that I think might provoke some conversation. Ride with Naganna. Naganna's back is broken, Siraj casually remarked while wiping the windshield of his black and yellow auto rickshaw as it sat parked on a residential street. Naganna, 57 years old, was asleep on the side of the street next to the auto rickshaw. He looked exhausted, and his face was wrinkled with pain. Alarmed, I asked Siraj, "How did this happen?" He snapped back, a bit irritated. "What do you think? Driving, what else?" After a momentary pause, he continued. They're digging the road for some electricity line near Care Hospital in Malakpet, so there's just loose gravel on the road. Plus, after last night's rains, the whole road is just full of potholes, very bumpy. Our man drove on that road, thud, 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 continuously, and now his back is hurting. The older we get, the less our bodies can handle these Hyderabadi roads. Naganna groaned in acknowledgement of Siraj's diagnosis of his lower back and of Hyderabad's roads and slowly sat up. Siraj, meanwhile, got us some chai from a nearby tea shop, and Naganna sipped it eagerly. Energized by his cup of chai, he offered to drop me at my destination in Malakpet. I realized that we would have to cross the same stretch of road that had ruined his back, so I said, No, don't drive today. I'll take another auto. You take rest. Nagana waved his hand, dismissing my concern. You think I can't drive on Hyderabad roads? I've been driving for longer than you've been alive, he protested. I could not help but laugh, and he continued. Anyway, people like me are used to driving on all kinds of roads. We drive every day on all kinds of roads, especially old city roads. You are only used to posh roads in Somajiguda, Jubilee Hills, High Tech City. One can even sleep on those roads. They are that smooth. In his candid comment about posh roads was a clear nod at my class status and a bitter acknowledgement of the fact that the quality of road surfaces and their regular maintenance and upkeep are not uniform. Poorer parts of the city are often marked by poorer roads. So 20 minutes later, Nagana and I were bouncing up and down in his rickety auto rickshaw, and the sensation of the unevenness of the road was amplified by the hollow skeleton of the rickshaw. The chiffon kurta that I was wearing offered no traction against the slippery surface of the seat I was sitting on, and I kept slipping off it. Nagana told me that it was while driving on this particular stretch that he broke his back, so to speak. Nagana had meanwhile deftly hoisted his wiry body off the seat. He was almost comically crouched, his small back barely touching the seat. As I tried to hold on to the railing of the rickshaw, I told him, "My bones are rattling." He said, "What bones are left? I feel like my insides have become faluda." He had a very sharp wit, generally. Soon after, in a tone that is best characterized as resentful resignation, he said, "You know, rich people, they fly even on these roads. The cars that they drive in, they're so superior that you don't feel these little potholes or bumps. Motorcyclists, cyclists, us auto drivers, we feel every bump on the road. I think we should make all the VIPs, PM, CM, MLA, MPs, drive in auto rickshaws for one full day. The roads will become better, or at least they will stop harassing us with challans." So, recent scholarship on Indian roads, right? They explore the visions, aesthetics, and the persuasions of modernity, progress, world classness, and all of these things that are, of course, shaping infrastructural transformation in cities. Here are some examples of the kind of like amazing work that talk about how the building of expressways, elevated highways, flyovers, ring roads. These infrastructures reproduce class inequality through planning, elitism, and neoliberal urbanization in India in general. And Hyderabad is also no stranger to what Stephen Graham, for instance, calls the fetishization of mega road projects. So you have projects like the Strategic Road Development Project, SRDP, which everyone is constantly talking about in Hyderabad, which one of my interlocutors noted has turned Hyderabad into a flyover city, right? And you have similarly the Nehru Outer Ring Road, an 8-lane expressway that hugs the city in a tight embrace and has become emblematic of Hyderabad's development and globality. But during my fieldwork, it was also common to hear that the city, it has become developed and all of that, but still there are just so many damn potholes, right? So talking about potholes saturated public discourse in the city. They came up in almost every conversation I had about driving and road traffic, particularly amongst riders of two-wheelers and auto rickshaws. So here are some examples of the kinds of pothole conversations that happen, right? My favorite quote is particularly this one, which says, "The road of Hyderabad can give people road shock. It is like what culture shock does to an individual." So there are all these ways in which people are constantly talking about potholes, right? That a national daily like the Hindu referred to the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation as Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation is perhaps indicative of this popular sentiment, right? So the state's emphasis on swanky expressways and smooth roads notwithstanding, the stubborn persistence of potholes engendered a counter discourse, one that constantly brought to fore the everyday experience of bumpiness, right? So the pervasiveness of potholes on the roads and in everyday conversations prompted me to really start thinking about it seriously. So what do potholes tell us about urban life, right? So I took a closer look at the ire, the annoyances, the grievances of motorists who encounter the potholes in their everyday movements. And in doing so, I was quite inspired by some key texts that have come out in recent times that really focus on how the materiality of roads shape urban mobility. So here I'm thinking of Jonathan Anjaria's new book called Mumbai on Two Wheels, which is on cycling in Mumbai, and it really offers a very, again, granular ethnographic perspective on what it's like to actually cycle in a city like Mumbai. Then you have Tarini Bedi's amazing article in Cultural Anthropology, which is looking at the sensate ecologies of driving work. So how do like taxi drivers in Mumbai, the Chilia drivers in Mumbai, how do they cope with infrastructural breakdown, right? And which is often found in these bumpy roads and the dusty air that they inhale. Then you have actually another article on potholes, like quite literally, which I was quite initially quite anxious to find out that somebody has already written about potholes. But it takes a fairly different look at potholes and offers this argument that wounding and being wounded is actually pretty much a factor and a facet of everyday life rather than an exception, right? So anyway, so all these like things that are happening in urban anthropology that inspired me to also take seriously the pothole as a site of inquiry and to focus on the abrupt, bumpy, and painful encounter between the body, the vehicle, and the pothole. So doing that kind of enabled me to look at potholes as more than just physical interruptions and inconveniences, but to actually see them as important sites at which motorists confront the state, experience and narrate class inequalities, and consolidate infrastructural dispositions. So I kind of make that claim in this paper by showing how potholes generate, sustain, and institutionalize narratives of state corruption. They also have this capacity to hurt, injure, and even kill certain motoring bodies, and therefore they are often made sense of in the register of pain and risk in the city. And they also actually spawn class-based engagement with the state, right? Through viral videos or through all these pothole-related social media campaigns. And I'll show you some examples of those in the talk. And finally, doing this work of taking the pothole seriously, right? Like rather than just thinking about it as something that people just experience, like what's the big deal, but actually like really overthinking it, if you will, helped me kind of see how driving and riding is a prominent mode of experiencing social inequality through the materiality of the road mediated by the vehicle one is driving on, right? So it really brings me to this question of why should we study the pothole? Like, what's the analytical impulse behind it? Now, the paper has a long lit review, which I welcome you all to read at your own time. I don't want to go into it because it takes too much time. But I will say two things here. So when I was doing fieldwork, I commonly came across the idea that power cuts and water scarcity affect only certain parts of the city. But potholes actually affect everyone because they're on the road, right? So there was this idea that the potholes are like this great equalizer in terms of the fact that they're everywhere, they're kind of recurrent and they're kind of ubiquitous, even though arguably they're more common in older parts of the city. But like even newer parts of the city had potholes on these city roads, right? So people were like, oh, potholes are like the big equalizer in that sense. Like every motorist and even pedestrians are actually affected by potholes, right? But as Naganna's vignette clearly demonstrates, and I will show through this article, potholes and bumpiness produce actually a very uneven geography of risk and pain, which is highly specific to who one is, where one is driving, and what one is driving, right? So the surface of the road produces its own inequalities via the physicality and mechanics of the vehicle one is driving or commuting in, which intersect with a wider set of infrastructural inequalities in the city. For instance, that Naganna was driving an auto rickshaw, is of a specific age, more often drives in an older part of the city, they all matter to how the bumpiness of the road affects him specifically, right? So in that sense, I would actually argue that potholes are not necessarily equalizers and that they do deepen social inequalities in particular ways. For instance, who can afford to buy an SUV to deal with the bad roads versus those who cannot, right? At the same time, it's also precisely at this juncture that potholes do offer something unique when it comes to urban infrastructures, unlike, say, well, power cuts and water supply, although you can make an argument for them too, but very directly, potholes are implicated in urban inequality through a very corporeal and visceral nature of encounter, right? There's something very sensorial about a pothole. There's something very jarring, very bumpy. So it kind of helps us center the embodied effects of infrastructures much more directly. Again, you can do that for water or electricity, of course, but something about the immediacy of that embodied encounter makes potholes actually interesting in that sense and surprisingly understudied considering how often we actually encounter them in everyday life. So in other words, potholes offer us a way to consider how sensations and affects shape urban inequality, right? So work on urban heat actually speaks beautifully to these sensorial questions. There's like a brilliant body of work on urban heat, especially thermal inequality, right? So potholes also offer that methodological and conceptual standpoint to enhance the various approaches we have to grasp the various manifestations of social inequality in India. So, by adopting an approach that centers the moment of jarring, bumpy encounter between the motoring body and the pothole, this article is inspired by sensorial and phenomenological framework of analysis. So, I treat the body as a site and an agent of experience, interpretation, analysis, and even critique, right? So, the idea is to like not just write about roads in urban India, but to actually write from them, from their jolts, their jerks, their pitfalls, and their pauses. Of course, there are other ways of studying potholes, and here I encourage more research in this direction. One approach towards studying potholes could involve how the state sees potholes, how it fixes roads, how repair and maintenance spawn socio-technical assemblages. There's one reviewer of this article said that, one could look at the bewildering world of municipal finance, where engineers and elected representatives and civil contractors negotiate what goes in and what comes out, right? So it's a study of municipal finance and repair. So a study that traces the institutional potholes that emerge in the bureaucratic pathways towards a smooth road surface would arguably be a fascinating account of repair. But that's not what I'm doing, right? But I do think that people should and can work on that. But I solely kind of look at the encounter between the body, the vehicle, and the pothole to foreground a sensorial approach to infrastructures. So yeah, this work was done in Hyderabad. Again, please do look at the paper for a longer explanation of why Hyderabad and what it offers is a particular site of analysis. Why Hyderabad on a personal level is just that I know the language. I did my high school there. It was easier for me to get access, as I said earlier, in Hyderabad over other cities that perhaps I could have done the same research in. But there are also specific things about Hyderabad that I think make it very interesting. One is, of course, that well, like other cities in India, it's also followed this path of neoliberal urbanization. There's been a lot of city-centric growth strategies and industrial policies, particularly the crafting of the high-tech city and Hyderabad as an IT and biotech hub since the late 1990s, right? Incidentally, Chandrababu Naidu, who was the chief minister of Andhra Pradesh then, of which Hyderabad was the capital, actually visited Singapore to be inspired to make Hyderabad a world-class city. So I always find it pretty ironic that I'm in Singapore now. But anyway, there's also this like uneven socio-spatial development in the city. So parts of the city are privileged as the face of world-class Hyderabad, and other parts are woefully neglected, right? And that's again pretty common in other parts of India. So there are resonances, of course. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind here is that roads also reflect this sort of socio-spatial unevenness, even in terms of municipal maintenance, right? So road maintenance is disaggregated in Hyderabad amongst several state agencies. So you have your Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, you have your National Highways Authority of India, you have your Roads and Building Department, you have the Hyderabad Road Development Corporation Limited, you have the Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority, and you have the Secunderabad Cantonment Board. So you have multiple agencies that are all involved in one way or the other in maintaining roads, right? So city roads actually in the city are the biggest source of complaint around potholes, not the national highways, neither the outer ring road and the expressway. People are more concerned about their, neighborhood roads, the city roads that are actually much of the roads in the city, right? So out of 9,000 kilometers of roads that fall under the jurisdiction of the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, only 709 are actually classified as main roads, which are 3 or more lane roads, right? And are topped with bitumen. So majority of the roads are actually internal roads, which are often the source of the problem, right? But it is the maintenance of main roads that is prioritized. And of late, it's been actually contracted out, outsourced to private contractors under the Comprehensive Road Maintenance Program. And I'm happy to talk more about that stuff during Q&A. But all this just to say that there is a fractured landscape of repair and maintenance when it comes to roads in the city as well, which of course gets reflected on how citizens experience state attention on their neighborhood ka road, So just to recap again that, there's been a rapid population growth as well as motorization spurt in the city. And I wanted to just point out that 80% of the 2020 figure, right, of the number of roads around Hyderabad cities are actually two-wheelers. And I think the data is similar even now. So majority of the motor vehicles on the roads are actually your motorcycles, scooters, cycles, right? And that matters because it really shapes, again, this question of who feels the road in what way and who's vulnerable to bumps in the road in specific ways, right? Um, so during my fieldwork, I found that the unevenness of roads was actually caught up in a broader commentary on how power and privilege shape urban development, right? So much like the observations that Naganna had made about roads in my part of the city, according to Siraj, who was also in the vignette, right? He said in Hyderabad, some roads are first class roads, some other roads are worse than village roads, right? And you notice the kind of imaginary of development at play here. And he says, if you notice, you'll see the best roads are all these roads that important people use, roads where important people live. Then when VIPs from other parts of the country or from outside India come visit, they only see our main roads and our VIP roads. And everyone says, wow, wow, Hyderabad roads are shandar. They don't know what regular people drive on every day. We who live in old city and nearby areas have just gotten used to potholes. Who cares about these areas, right? So, like Siraj, many of my interlocutors pointed out how the best roads in the city are actually those located around the residences and workplaces of the political and economic elite of the city. So, contrasting to the VIP roads, roads in older parts of the city were often brought up as being in disrepair. And this sensuous knowledge was most evocatively captured in newspaper about bone rattling roads in Old City that the author says are in such a bad condition that people cannot help but feel a lump in their throat before setting out into the city, right? Quite an emotional sort of sentence there. So for my interlocutors who lived and drove around older parts of Hyderabad, southern and southern eastern parts of the city, the unevenness of governance was quite simply felt in the unevenness of the roads, particularly since they experienced the roads via lightweight vehicles like auto rickshaws and motorbikes. But that roads in older and more economically marginalized parts of the city are in disrepair is actually not that surprising, right? This is what one would expect to find, considering what we know about how political and economic power is spatialized in cities all over the world. But what was surprising to me was that even those who drove two wheelers in hot real estate markets around the IT hub, right? They did not feel like the roads were any better. And this might resonate with some of you who are in Bangalore. The kind of complaint is the same as like there are all these like hot real estate markets, there's all these fancy gated communities and these IT offices and all, right? But the roads are still pretty bad and full of potholes. And so here you have Madhapur and Kondapur, two neighborhoods in Hyderabad that are known to be like, neighborhoods in the IT hub of the city. There are constant complaints about potholes and bad roads in these parts of the city as well, right? So the roads in parts of the city that index the promise of world classness were often pockmarked and prone to flooding and disrepair. And this became a matter of much experiential dissonance and discontent amongst my interlocutors. So, take the case of Arvind, a businessman in his 30s who lives in an apartment in a gated community in the northern western neighborhood of Kukatpalli, right? He tells me that his rides are a vantage point from which he makes sense of urban development. Talking about the inconsistency of road surfaces, stretches of potholes, loose gravel, dug up roads, during his ride to work, he comments, look at our shiny metro, look at our malls, look at our Deloitte office, Microsoft office, all these big global companies, our posh gated communities. It all looks really fancy on paper, but then you go out on the roads and even the supposedly developed high tech areas and you drive, immediately you feel so frustrated with the traffic and the potholes. And then he says, when your body feels those jerks and bumps of uneven roads, so many potholes here and there, you feel the hollowness of all this development. Whatever political party you elect, the corruptness of the entire system is right here in these potholes for everyone to see. So for Arvind, the jerks of the road are not simply physical irritants while driving, but they actively contribute to his assessment of urban governance, right? So his body becomes a site of interpreting urban change and state corruption, and the sensation of bumpiness consolidates his disappointments vis-a-vis governance, right, and infrastructure. This is not to say that his critique is consolidated only through his experiences on the road. We all know that corruption talk in India is like pervasive, right? Like everyone's always talking about corruption. But it is this everyday sensory, mundane engagement with driving in the city that reinforces this understanding. It becomes a site of narrating the everyday effects of corruption. So, a member of the urban middle class that is promised a smooth road quite literally feels the intimacy of betrayal in his bones, right? So, potholes were sensorially apprehended as a glaring rupture in the state narrative of aspirational urbanism, and middle class and elite imaginations of what functional infrastructures should look and feel like. Similarly, according to Srujan, a 32-year-old techie who rides a motorcycle, every time one drives on the road, one is reminded of corruption. You don't even have to read the papers to know that. Just drive. The feel of the road says it all, right? So Srujan's invocation to just drive is an instructive one here and gets at the heart of thinking about dispositions to the state, how they are constituted and consolidated on the road. So there is this like embodied political subject that emerges while driving, right? Rather than a dispassionate and disembodied participant in a discursive public sphere alone, which is what we normally think of as a political sphere, is newspaper or like, conversation, right? But here Shujan is like, you just drive on the road. You don't have to read the papers to know that the state is corrupt, right? So whether encountered in older parts of the city or newer parts, potholes are narrativized as an intimate and embodied experience of state corruption, right? So they're interpreted not just as a problem of governance, they also indicate a problem with governance. And they become material evidence of the everyday theories of corruption that construct the state in everyday imagination. So there was a retired lecturer from local college, for instance, who once told me ministers get kickbacks, contractors get kickbacks, some official at GHMC, Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, gets kickbacks, and we get potholes, right? So there are these ways in which people narrativize this corruption, right? Further, there's a distinct temporality and seasonality to these narratives of spatialized inequality and state corruption. So every monsoon, for instance, news media and social media are flooded with images and videos of waterlogged streets. And for motorists, this often means eroded roads, right? Proliferation of potholes and a lot of traffic bottlenecks. And so in a satirical article on this particular issue of post-monsoon driving, journalist Sirish Nanisetti writes, to drive perfectly like a Hyderabadi, you have to be a scholarly motorist. You need the mindset of a class 7 student, where the main trick involves memorizing the potholes, manholes, and their locations. And after every monsoon, you're in class 8, and you have to learn another set of potholes and manholes. So in likening driving in the city to being a student who memorizes the shifting locations of potholes and manholes, Nanisetti leverages not just the culturally intimate vexation around the unreliability of infrastructure, but also hints at how motorists are expected to adapt their bodily practices to adjust to roads that are eroded by rains, right? So driving slower, braking more often, avoiding internal roads, or even switching to public transportation. So these ways of grappling with holes are all these micro adjustments that we make in order to cope with a state that does not quite, in quotes, care, right, about this issue. So from this point of view, rains do not just actually constitute a logistical hassle, but they also play a very clarifying role. Seasonally, they confirm the collective suspicion that the state is ineffective and corrupt. For instance, a 2016 article in the Deccan Chronicle starts with the grim statement that potholes have become money spinners, right? And unpacks the generally held consensus or theory around why roads in Hyderabad get so easily damaged upon a bout of heavy rains, that the materials being used to fix roads are purposely of poor quality, so there's a need to frequently fix roads, which then becomes a steady source of income for contractors and, by extension, corrupt officials. Right? So this is the kind of like generally heard theory. I'm sure many of you have also already come across this. But there's another way in which potholes come to matter in the city, right? And in that sense, when it comes to injuries, deaths, and crashes, which are always omnipresent, when you take motorization, it comes with risk, right? But the very concept of risk undergoes a shift when one centers the pothole, right? So it moves from being a risk of a crash or a fall all the time to becoming a mundane accumulation of jolts and jerks, particularly in the case of motorbikes, cycles, and auto rickshaws, right? So the unevenness of the road creates an uneven geography of pain, vulnerability, and risk that is highly mediated by what one is driving. So as was the case with Naganna, auto rickshaw drivers are already prone to a lot of backaches and spinal discomfort, quite simply because of the amount of time they spend driving, right? It's a very uncomfortable job to do, right? It's a very bodily difficult job to do, bus driving, cab driving, whatever kind of driving labor there is. But what I found interesting was how the auto rickshaw and cab drivers often narrated their ability to withstand the assault of bumpiness on their bodies as evidence of resilience, toughness, and working class masculinity. So Chakri, an auto rickshaw driver in his 40s, put it to me in this way, right? He said, being an auto rickshaw driver means being able to handle these potholes, these aches and pains. The job of auto driving is not for men who make a fuss about these things. So Chakri's candid appraisal of what auto rickshaw driving work and the kind of man it necessitates obviously excludes women, right? But what I want to highlight here is that his version of driving work implies an acceptance of pain and bodily discomfort on gendered terms. So the pothole actually, interestingly, becomes a site for the performance of working class masculinity. How much can you quite handle, right? I mean, Nagana's insistence that, I'm actually fine, like, I can drive, I've driven on these sorts of potholes before, becomes a way also of a certain kind of performance of working class masculinity, or like a certain sort of pushback against a perceived societal status, perhaps, right? And we can talk a little more about that during Q&A, but I thought it was an interesting point that came up, particularly amongst driver workers, right? And I can also speak more about women and infrastructural breakdown during Q&A. I don't quite cover that. I think about gender as masculinity here. I don't quite think about women, but we can talk about that during Q&A. But of course, driver workers are not the only ones who experience the pain of potholes, right? So in the past decade, there's been a lot of conversation about what potholes are doing to two-wheeler riders. So how are the figure of the techie going to work? How is a techie, for instance, dealing with a spinal injury, or like the tons of other motor bike riders that there are? But what's interesting is that unlike in the case of driving work, when it comes to just the motorcycle rider, the experience of pain is actually not normalized, or it doesn't get folded into a performance of masculinity, but it's framed as a very important civic issue, right? And there are lots of newspaper articles, for instance, about how and why potholes are causing back injuries amongst IT workers in the city, and who are often riding motorcycles, right? And I think I could not do fieldwork on this, but I think it'd be very interesting to compare that to like Rapido drivers or Swiggy drivers, or like, again, another kind of labor performed primarily on motorbikes, right? So how does the bumpiness of the road actually impact their movements? It's something I couldn't quite take a look at during my fieldwork, but I think is important to take a look at. So in the paper, I talk about this person, Nitin, as well, who actually had a pre-existing spinal issue that got worse because he was riding a motorbike for 2 hours to and fro home. And finally, he ended up buying an SUV, right? Now, there's some people who can afford to buy their way out of this kind of everyday discomfort of the road, but a lot of people can't, right? At the same time, while an auto rickshaw driver like Naganna might have very little to do with an IT worker like Nitin, they are like, miles apart when it comes to their vehicles, their class and caste locations are very different, their occupational compulsions are very different. They do share similar experience of pain, injury, and discomfort by the pothole. So I'm always trying to point to this resonance but difference thing going on with potholes, right? And so, at times, this issue of risk and vulnerability got quite deepened by the other thing that was going on when I was doing fieldwork, is that this conversation about pothole deaths, right? So can potholes actually kill people? So in the case of riders and commuters of two-wheelers, this kept coming up a lot. Like, you'd have instances of somebody sitting in the back of a bike, and then a bus in front braked quickly because there's a pothole, and then, there's a crash, and then the pillion rider falls off and dies, right? Like I'm sure you again come across many of these instances where potholes are narrativized and constructed as causing deaths on the road, right? So the Indian state too actually began to account for death and injury enabled by potholes. So in 2017, the Minister of State in charge of road and highways announced in the Indian Parliament that between 2015 and 2017, more than 9,300 persons had died and 25,000 people had been injured in pothole-related road accidents in the country. Now, these figures were pretty disturbing, but they also caught the attention of international media outlets. And Guardian, for instance, published a story on this very issue with the headline basically saying more deadly than terrorism, potholes responsible for killing 10 people a day in India, right? More recently, it was reported that 5,000 people all over the country had died in one single year. I think it was 22 due to potholes. So potholes, despite their astonishingly banal ubiquity in the city become spectacular around specific incidents, particularly in news media. But see, the thing is that fixing the blame on a pothole is actually not that simple. From the perspective of police officials that I spent time with, potholes alone seldom caused deaths. So my interlocutors in the traffic police department were often cognizant of how road engineering and infrastructure was an issue that caused unsafety on the roads, but they often pushed back and said, look, deaths are a result of motorists and pillion riders not wearing helmets or wearing helmets that are substandard. Like falls might be caused due to potholes, but deaths might be caused because people are not wearing protective headgear, right? So from a traffic policing perspective, a helmet might reduce the severity of damage to the head, thereby mitigating the possibility of death. And often, of course, police also claim that pothole accidents were because of rash driving, which is never properly defined, to be honest, but rash driving, speeding, bad lighting, or a combination of all three. So in one particular case during my fieldwork that I write about, there's a young woman who's sitting behind her brother on a scooter, right? And she falls off the scooter, hits her head on the divider, and dies instantly. Now, the rider, her brother, told the police that he was avoiding a pothole. So he swerved suddenly and she lost balance and fell off the bike. Now, the police said that she should have been wearing a helmet. The rider insisted that the fall was caused by the pothole. The police insisted that the death was caused by her own negligence, right? So in this particular case, the resolution was a bit easier because police had access to the CCTV footage and they interpreted the evidence of the rider actually indulging in what they called rash and negligent driving, that there was no pothole in sight. But the rider in a television interview or a local news channel basically said that there was a pothole, there was a small pothole that he was trying to avoid, and he was trying to overtake the car in the first place because of the pothole, right? The TV reporter also conducting the interview insisted, and he said, police say that helmets are the reason people die, but we citizens ask, why are there so many potholes that cause deaths in the first place? Potholes here become a springboard for pointing out the contradictions within the road safety discourse promoted by the state, especially regarding highly vulnerable road users, like the drivers of two-wheelers, who are actually the most vulnerable road users after pedestrians on the street, right? So Kumar, a citizen activist, also said to me once that police say that people died because they weren't wearing helmets and that people don't value their own lives. Lies. The pothole was the reason they died, but instead, nicely, the police blame the dead victims' risk-taking mentality. How will a helmet save me if I fall off a bike and come under the wheels of a bus, or if I break my spine, right? So going beyond the first step that we started this paper with, that is charging the state with being corrupt, there's something much more personal about pothole deaths, right? Because they expose the kind of double standards of the rhetoric around road safety for two-wheeler riders, especially. So while there's been a state-led emphasis on road safety in the past decade, the materiality, sensation, and consequences of the roads were being interpreted by my interlocutors as contradicting this very message, right? So the literal ruptures in the road surfaces are framed as ruptures in the state-led road safety narrative aimed at disciplining drivers. Now, finally, and I'm going to conclude with this, but obviously, there is mobilization and claims making around this issue, right? So, there is enough complaint in the city that snowballed into specific campaigns that people are taking part in to highlight their grievances, right? So in theory, citizens should be able to register their complaints about potholes with the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation by either using their helpline or their website, or there's an app as well. But the dominant experience of my interlocutors was that the corporation was highly unresponsive and complaints seemed to vanish into thin air once they're lodged, right? So the other issue that came up, which relates to the point that I was making earlier, is that different stretches of roads are governed by different state agencies. So you have, again, HMDA, HRDCL, and figuring out who to report to seemed unnecessarily complicated to my interlocutors, who could not often navigate the government websites to figure out who they were supposed to complain to, right? So because of these sorts of issues with the formal mode of complaining, there are a lot of creative ways in which people have tried to address this issue of potholes, right? So one popular person that I also met during my fieldwork is Dr. Gangadhar Katnam, who is popularly known as Road Doctor in the city. He is in his 70s now and is a retired railway engineer, and he spent the past decade fixing potholes on the roads in the city using his own funds in a car that he has named pothole ambulance. I don't know if you can see it here. So he, along with his wife or a volunteer, often travel around specific residential neighborhoods and fill up potholes with tar and cement wherever they're able to. He's actually given several interviews to local, national, international media as well. I actually first found out about him. I think there's an article on BBC or something about him, and that's how I came to know that he was doing this work. So he refers to his work as Shramdan, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but like loosely put, labor donation, which has moral connotations, right? So this striking image of a senior citizen and a member of the moral middle class that Sanjay Srivastava talks about in his work, having to take up the work of the state on his shoulders, has become quite emblematic of a frustrated citizenry in Hyderabad, right? Similarly, in 2022, a group of citizens came together to not just repair potholes on the Miapur Bachpalli road, but also to float paper boats addressed to the state agency that had apparently been ignoring their complaints for several weeks, right? So, resolutely, the agenda of middle class activism, citizens coming together to pool their labor and financial resources, has become more recurrent. So yeah, I just wanted to end with this because there are tons of these sorts of, again, campaigns. People are coming together, filling potholes. There's a photography contest, take a selfie with a pothole. There are like installations. For instance, Badal Nanjandasamy in Bangalore has done with the pothole as a sort of, like a lake or like a crater on the moon, right? And there was a bridal photo shoot by a woman Kochi to highlight the problem of potholes in her neighborhood, people planting trees in potholes. My favorite is this tweet when the traffic fines were being increased by the MV amendment in 2019. Somebody put up this tweet saying, we are ready, but what about you? So there's a person doing, like yoga with a helmet in a pothole, right? So now, again, I don't want to overstate the potentials of these media, campaigns, because of course they are coming from a specific class position. You need to have a smartphone, a kind of social media sensibility or access to media channels to get your voice heard, right? And it's not often likely that people respond. So this is all very kind of like shooting in the dark sort of a thing. But it is still interesting that these sorts of responses are coming up, and we might want to again do more research on that front. So with that, I will end because a lot of this is already in the paper, but I'll just end with 3 points that, so the everyday habitus of drivers essentially, shapes how they orient themselves to urban infrastructures, plans, and futures, and it influences their everyday politics in return, right? Then we also can think about the bumpiness of the road as actually being a metaphor for urban life at large, how people make sense of it, how people make sense of the bottleneck and the bump in terms of their interactions with the state. And finally, which is really the conceptual heart of this paper, is like, potholes help us think about how sensations and tactility become a mode of deepening social inequality in the city. And they're not just like a background, like the road is not a background to everyday life, but actually actively generates feelings, generates politics, right? And yeah, so on that note, I'll stop. I know I went on for a little too long, sorry, but I hope it was interesting enough, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sneha, for this really enlightening talk about how everyday sensory experiences can be a site for us to understand social inequalities. I'm sure it gave us all something to ponder about. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Ishan Shahi for any insights, questions that he may have, post which we'll also have Vedal with his questions.
We cannot hear you, Ishan. At least I cannot.
Yeah,
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Uh, Thanks for the reminder and thank you for the talk and the paper. Dr. Sneha, it was a very, very interesting paper and a very interesting talk as well. Now, the paper also points to certain aspects of our cities that we live in and ways of experiencing them, and not all of them are the same. So, while there are I'll highlight I'll divide my comments and reflections into two parts. First will be some of the major things that your paper made me think about, right? And in that way, you could also take them as my compliments to your work. Okay, so. one of the first things that it made me think about was the fact, as you point out, that only 80% of the vehicles in Hyderabad are two-wheelers. Effectively, only 7% households in India own private cars. Right. And again, the point about you make the point about oculocentrism, about from which you wanted to move away from. I mean, and I returned to it because it drew my attention about how most of the desirable infrastructure, over bridges and four-lane roads, are designed in such a way that the experience of seeing the city from within a car driving over over an over bridge is uh, an elevated experience. You feel like you've arrived and it's beautiful. And I am coming. I've not been to Hyderabad for an extended period of time, and I haven't driven there. But I have had this experience in Lucknow and a similarly gentrified area of Lucknow, Gomti Nagar. So if you drive over a certain stretch of an area, while similarly walking under the flyover gives you so contrasting experiences of the city, because under flyovers are where you find the homeless people, the smell of piss, because you're walking. If you're driving, you don't know what it smells like. uh, so one is the attachment to so of course there is a lot of urban inequality in all of the way policies are being framed here, but why is it's strange to me, why is the car driving modal citizen, right, so important, and at less than 7% of the total population, effectively, right? What does it tell us about a lot of the electoral politics as equalizing mechanism discourse? And secondly, uh, look, I've just made this note about, yes, here we are. So, and secondly, and joining this is the point that you make about, Chandrababu Naidu visiting Singapore to get inspiration. Why don't anyone copies the housing model of Singapore ever? Because all the driving, traffic on the road, it inevitably reaches out to the fact that people cannot afford to live close to their places of work. Hence, they have extremely long driving times. Hence, they drive more than they need to, and roads are bad, they need more repair. And cities keep expanding because people cannot afford to live in areas, uh, increasingly in areas across the city, because everything keeps becoming expensive, and that's how we have built our economy of pumping up real estate prices. And since the section of, I mean, ironically, I did my PhD from IIT Bombay, so I did travel there, and I also looked it up. So in Mumbai, the Mumbai 2,500, 2,400 people die a year in the Mumbai locals, which is an astonishing number.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something about how do we move the conversation from just urban inequality, problem of traffic, to and link it firmly to the issue of housing. Because while yes, scholarship is one part of it, but moving the conversation to housing is important if we want our cities to be livable places and not just places of insane and unending rent extraction. Uh, okay, so other than that, this was my teeny tiny nitpicking with your work is do you I mean, one part is you mentioned that it could be very interesting to look at how the whole municipal finance and tenders for road repairs. Have you managed to look at it for your book, and could you tell us more about it? And the teeny tiny nitpicking that I was going to come at is I guess do you think that it would have been more helpful if the typology of suspensions, not just autos and two-wheelers and expensive cars, could be a bit more refined? So autos, the smaller freight vehicles, all use leaf spring suspensions. And as the cars become better, you go to a McPherson strut, or very expensive cars use air suspensions, and so on and so forth. It is something that you might find more relevant. I mean, that point of data analytics becomes helpful when you're talking to medical professionals and their patients, and how filtering people who have back injuries and filtering them based on the kind of vehicles they drive, and organizing that data in that manner. So for now, that will be it, and I'm waiting for what Vedal has to say. Also, brief, there's some ambient noise because the place I'm working from, monkeys are jumping on the terrace, and they may soon enough pull the Wi-Fi connection out. So if I disappear for a while, please understand me.
I was just thinking of monkeys the other day because my entire college experience was battling monkeys that were constantly coming into the room somehow and just, yeah, stealing all kinds of things. So, all sympathies, and thank you so much for the comments. There's so much here to think about. And I will respond after Vedal.
Dr. Sneha, you could either answer the questions right now, or we could also have Vedal's questions, post which you could answer both of them together, whatever
No,
works for your convenience.
I'll hear from Vedal first so that, maybe if there are resonances that I can just respond at the same time.
So, firstly, thanks a lot, Dr. Sneha. It was an evocative paper and a presentation as well. So, as a student of political science, hearing potholes as something banal and everyday disruptions was something I never thought could be transformed into political terrains. And I think it's a very good intervention that you've made. Adding to what Dr. Ishan had already commented, and as you mentioned in the paper about Hyderabad being turned into a flyover city, I come from Nagpur, and we have around 7 to 8 flyovers. Thanks to thanks to the fact that we have Nitin Gadkari representing the Lok Sabha constituency, that we have so many flyovers. But I think adding to what Ishan Shahi said, ki flyovers contrast the lives above and below. So basically, we have different contrasting lives above and below that. So and also the fact that we have throughout the presentation and session, we've been able to see that we have been looking on embodied persons, like, so we have been talking about bodies which are mobile, which can drive, and which have the ability to absorb the shock. So I was particularly interested if you have ever come across people who are differently able and have been able to witness these shocks, and so, like, what your framework of embodied person, embodied politics could maybe extend to those whose very ability to move is very is limited. And secondly, I was also struck about the vignette you presented about Chakri. So the very idea that absorbing shock is being a sign of masculinity, and yeah, the foreground, how mobility is now struck and through such potholes is gendered. So I was wondering if you encountered with any women drivers who experienced the same thing with as you presented the vignettes of these people. So yeah.
Thank you. These are great questions. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to think about here. I asked the last one first because it's actually something that I was in the paper that I took it out because the paper was becoming too long. But one, I mean, Hyderabad doesn't have a lot of women auto rickshaw drivers, and at the time that I was doing research, there were maximum 5 that people knew about, right? And I had the privilege of interviewing Narayanamma, who's one of the most popular auto rickshaw drivers in Hyderabad. Although now she drives for Uber, which is saying saying something. She doesn't drive an auto anymore. But when I was doing fieldwork in 2019, I met her, and we actually took a ride together. And this issue came up about pain, and I said something like, "Oh, this auto rickshaw driver was telling me that you're driving a van." And several auto rickshaw drivers often told me that like toughness is something, it's a man's job, right? Which is why you don't have a lot of women auto rickshaw drivers. She actually countered and she said, women have more tolerance for pain than men do. So actually, if you think about it, there should be more women in auto rickshaw driving professions. And she pushed back that was a physical issue. She pointed to other infrastructural paucities, right? Like the lack of public toilets. And she was a bit like, that's one of the biggest reasons that women can't often leave the neighborhood also while they're driving their auto rickshaws, especially on days when they might need access to safe and clean toilets. And she pointed out to other sorts of social issues and not physical issues as much, which was really fascinating to me and yeah, made a lot of sense. She also kind of talked about, I mean, she's somebody who loves driving. And in the chapter on speed, I talk about her a little bit because she's somebody who constantly talk about how she loves speeding and accelerating, which was something that she often associated with feeling like breaking free from some kinds of bounds of being confined to the home or assumed to be a private body because you're a woman, right? And so she would talk about pleasure a lot more than she would talk about pain when it came to driving. And I think she also did that intentionally because she was kind of tired of the stereotyping of women finding it difficult in the auto driving profession. So she would always put forward her narrative as being one that was where she foregrounded the pleasure of driving as being very, very important for her to be a driver. So I would say that the women motorists I spoke to often shared similar complaints around pain that the two-wheeler riders that are not driver workers shared. But the other aspect that came up in Harris Solomon's work, which I will say is a very, very interesting point that he makes, is that because often because there is a gendering of driving in India, right? Most motorists are men. A lot of women are sitting in the back. And a lot of accidents which involve pillion riders are actually accidents of women falling off the bikes, right? And also helmet use amongst the rider has become a little more common, but people sitting in the back still don't really wear helmets. So he pointed how that particular risk of injury is also gendered in a very counterintuitive way, something we don't really think about, but actually is affecting more women than we realize. So in these ways, I think the women question does get answered, which I had to omit because again, the paper was becoming very, very long. Then I will say to both the question of flyovers and below flyovers, I just want to give a shout out to this PhD student, Asila Haq, Aseelahaque. Asila has written a fantastic paper in this journal. I think it's called Urban Planning, but it's on flyovers from below. So she's looking at flyovers in Karachi. And she's kind of looking at the life worlds that exist below these flyovers, and she's kind of making this point about how flyovers have become the kind of dream project of a lot of politicians precisely because they are big, they're visible, they're like these spectacular infrastructures that particular political parties can be associated with, right? Like the afterlife of that association is very strong. So for instance, the SRDP project in Hyderabad is actually associated with Bharatiya Rashtra Samiti BRS party, even though it's no longer in power. So Congress is downplaying SRDP, but it was KT Ramarau's child in that sense, right? So there are, and Govind Gopakumar, who has a book called Installing Automobility, actually makes this point as well, that these big road infrastructures, coming to Ishan's point as well, are often, of course, wound up with electoral politics around visibility. Like even though they actually don't serve a lot of people in the constituency, right? But they become these iconic projects. And people are interpolated into sharing what you were saying, this ocular, this visual appeal, right? So like in Hyderabad, this Durgam Cheruvu cable bridge that came up, the whole selling point was it's a tourist place, right? They've made selfie points possible. So you're also creating this Instagrammable city, right, so to speak, and through road infrastructure and these big projects. And there was this one case, which I kind of bring up in a chapter in the book, but there was this biodiversity flyover that was inaugurated with a lot of enthusiasm and celebration. And basically, within like a week of its inauguration, two people died because they were like sort of hanging out at the edge of the flyover, taking a picture to get the skyline of the IT hub of the city from the flyover, right? And the flyover was like new, swanky, very, very well lit. And so taking pictures of that, and then a car driver was driving at great speed, and these 6 young men were just hanging at the edge of the flyover, and he hit them, and 2 of them actually fell off the flyover, right? So these, like, again, like, when does a city or this particular spectacular infrastructure become too enchanting? Like, they're supposed to be enchanting, but they're not supposed to be disenchanting that people actually, like, risk their own, like, lives, right? So it's a question of, like, what's being managed here is a certain kind of expectation, again, of world classness in cities, and this, like, investment towards aesthetics, absolutely. And I think there is so much damage that that's doing, to not just like non-motorists, but also to pedestrians, who are really the most highly vulnerable road users and are completely cast out of these projects, right? They can't walk. And like a lot of these big highways that encourage speed, or these big road widening projects, are just rendering pedestrians more and more vulnerable, right? Like, I tried to cross the road on Jubilee Hills, which has been widened in the recent past, and now in Hyderabad, they're trying to do away with signals. They're trying to do, like, like long roundabouty sort of thing, but that just means traffic is flowing continuously, and that's the point. They want the traffic to flow, right? But in the absence of crosswalks, you basically can't cross. I had to take an auto and spend like 60 rupees or something just to like take a U-turn, which is absolutely absurd. But the intention of flows is such that the pedestrian is kind of cast out of that imagination of planning, right? And I completely agree. I think housing has a lot to do with it. Even this development of outer ring road in Hyderabad has spurred a lot of gated communities, extremely expensive, right? People living in the outskirts, but then them needing a lot of the oppressed caste class populations to service their apartments. So there's a lot of moving out that's happening now. That those who can afford cars and private vehicles are able to go to and from the city at great speeds, because outer ring road allows you to travel at 120 kilometers per hour, right? But for the service class, it's absolutely impossible to find public transportation options, right? So there's again a reliance again on private transport then to make that bridge possible, right? So like bikes and scooters becoming more and more common in order to make up for the fact that there's absolutely no public transport infrastructure there. So housing has a lot to do with it. I don't personally study it, unfortunately, because I was more interested in the question of traffic, but I completely agree that it's absolutely linked, and it's something that I will remember to kind of bring up and speak to more directly in the framing of the book. So that's really, really helpful. Thank you. The other thing, I think 2 things are also important to keep in mind here, I would say. Why is the car driver becoming this like model citizen, right? And so Govind Gopakumar writes about how this is sort of a part and parcel of a certain, like it's a politically driven project. I was not sure how this works, because I don't know how electoral politics makes space for it when most people are actually being inconvenienced, not convenienced, right? And that'd be a fascinating study to actually figure out how and why this is going on. But I will say that there's been a lot of interesting writing on cars as being status symbols, right? Which we know of, but also like marital prospects being hinged on whether somebody has a car or not. And we see this coming up often in pop culture, right? So you might want to think about what consumer capitalism is doing in this regard, like how are cars positioned as being like sort of these engines of a good life, right? And no matter how much critical discourse there is around the fact that our cities are unlivable, car sales are I mean, I'll have to check the numbers on this, not something I've checked, but there is a cultural narrative about a car owning person being successful, right? Like economically, and that is the work of selling the car as not just a transportation object, but an aspirational object, right? As something that indicates status, like makes you more eligible bachelor or whatever. And it's very gendered again, like it's about men owning a car and then being able to find a partner that would that is worth them or whatever. Now the thing about Bombay trains is very fascinating. This book called Lifelines by Harris Solomon, which essentially takes this to task entirely. So he's looking at the train death being this thing that just happens and is so hyper normalized in some ways, but is also so spectacular and grisly in other ways. So it's sort of like a wound in the public imagination, but it also keeps happening. So he's sort of like studying that more directly. And I think, there's so much more to to think about that. Even this question of speed, right? It keeps coming up. Like one person, a very critical reader of this piece of mine, was like, are you saying that speeds are good or smooth roads are good? But keep in mind that speeding actually kills more people. Absolutely true. I'm not saying that, like smooth roads are the answer. In fact, municipal engineers that I spend time with would often point out that for Indian drivers, bumpiness is more important because they drive slower. In fact, if you leave buttery smooth roads, then people are just like, driving very, very riskily, right? Absolutely true. And I'm not trying to say that smooth roads are the way to go. I think actually public transport, infrastructure, pedestrianization are important interventions. But there is something here to think about, right? Like how these big roads that are actually causing the most number of accidents, that they are the sites of most number of accidents, not potholes. Potholes are a sliver of the accidents. Actually, it is big high-speed roads. So, and still they're encouraged, right? And there's still, again, like the appeal of this sort of infrastructural spectacularity seems to override even the brute fact that expressways, ring roads are where most deaths, like horrible deaths happen, right? So yeah, there's something to think about there. At an everyday basis, I can say that a lot of people suffer congestion and slowness so much that they desire speed. It's actually like from an ethnographer point of view, I'm like, I can tell you what people within the framework of automobility think. And it's mostly just that, okay, man, I'm like tired of this congested road. Now, when I get a chance to speed, I'm going to speed, right? But yeah, it needs to be, of course, interrogated critically. Chandrababu Naidu did actually come back to Hyderabad and start something called Singapore Township and Malaysian Township. Malaysian Township still exists. Singapore Township has been named Sanskriti Township. But yeah, they did not quite import the ideals of public housing. They just, I think, wanted to bring, or the idea was to create a hub that was spur development around that region. So this area of Hyderabad was renamed Cyberabad, and it's still Cyberabad, and it has its own jurisdictions. That's Cyberabad Police, and like they have there was this imagination there, but it's not really quite fruitioned in the way that Singapore, for instance, has privileges these local economies, right, of housing and work and hospitals, healthcare, education, all of that. Then I will say that the question of tenders, no, I don't actually look at it. One of the reasons is that I couldn't get access. I mean, it was very simple. Like municipal corporation was, the reason I started studying police. One was, of course, like my caste and class privilege made possible certain networks that enabled access, right? But the other reason was the traffic police were very happy to be studied. They were like, yeah, come, whatever. Like, and they were traffic police, they're not law and order police. They weren't like, like, what is she going to write some expose on like what, right? So they were pretty chill about it. But the municipal corporation, it was absolutely very, very difficult to get any access. In fact, like the few interviews I got also was through journalist friends who knew somebody, and but they were just not quite interested in yeah. And I mean, I don't know. RT, Regional Transport Authority, was the other one. So when I was doing research on bribery and brokerage, I tried to speak to some officials. Not very keen. So yeah, it was more of an access issue. I absolutely love your point about suspensions. I will take a closer look. I think that's a great point. I'm so terrible with all this. It's ironic to me that I'm studying transportation. Firstly, I did not drive, as I said. Second thing, I don't know much about vehicles. So, it's like really, I feel like it's quite ridiculous that sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I really have to speak to somebody who knows their stuff. So that's a really good reminder, and I will be sure to take a closer look at that to include in the book. And I think it absolutely is a very, very important point. Question about disability also very, very key, very important, especially around sidewalks, especially around access as we imagine, in terms of just, again, like what would smoothness of a road do to other kinds of wayward mobilities, right? And Asila, again, I come back to Asila, her work is really, really cool. Asila was conceptualizing a term wayward mobilities, and she was kind of talking about these things that, again, planners are not planning for, but they do exist, and they do kind of, people tinker with infrastructure in interesting ways to make cities work for themselves, right? So yeah, something to think about there. I was interested in disability disability studies having some resonance with this precisely because there's a question of injury and what this how we're all temporarily abled, right? That's something that a lot of disability scholars point out. So how do potholes and bumpy roads kind of deepen that experience of injury and disablism further? I think that there is some resonance there, but yeah, I don't do entire justice to it. Pedestrian exclusions is again another place in which one could interrogate it further and think about which kind of pedestrian, right? Are we always thinking of people who can walk? Because that's not the only road user that we should be planning for, right? So instead of having a lot of stairs, like a lot of these foot over bridges have a lot of stairs, right? So again, those are apparently pedestrian infrastructures, but they don't make sense if you put in place anyone who cannot take stairs, right? I developed knee issues. I've had 2 knee surgeries. I have a hip issue. I have chronic pain in the past 3 years that I've developed. And now when I go back to Hyderabad, it is so difficult. Like everything is uneven. So I'm walking and, I'm like stressing my joints out in ways that are absolutely terrible for me. In a lot of places, there are no elevators or escalators. So there are lots of stairs. And so I can't actually take them. I have to take them one by one by one. It's like the way it slows you down, the way it shapes your relationship with infrastructure is all really important questions. And actually, I can trace my own implication through my fieldwork. But I was fine when I was doing the bulk of the fieldwork. Now I go back, it is a very different relationship to the city infrastructure. So yeah, absolutely, very, very important point, and one that we need so much more research on. I was just reading a review paper on disability and GIS, for instance, and how disability is actually lacking in GIS and geospatial imaginations of data collection even. So yeah, really excellent points. Thank you. I think I've covered most of them, I think. But I'm happy to open it up now.
Sorry, I just wanted to, on the point of cars as status symbol and a lot of, perhaps something for all of us to think about. I know through other sort of personal connections that today a lot of government planning is effectively being done by consulting firms. It has led to this. It's a cancer of selfie points and I heart XYZ place in a remote location, like not even a fancy name. I heart Padrona really broke my heart. Uh,
Yeah.
That's one of the things. But could we also see? Could it also be a good way to examine white papers of consulting firms and what's their role and what do you think they've been up to in Hyderabad specifically? Because I do know in other places, like my work is in Banaras and they've been involved in everything, right? Now, the specific papers they wrote for a particular project may not come out in public and I may not be able to join it, but it becomes so apparent that their hands are everywhere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Diganta Das, who's also in Singapore, actually, I think his book should be coming out soon, which is on these sorts of questions around like politics and consultancy, right? And how they're shaping urban planning, particularly in Hyderabad. And Diganta has a bunch of articles also out, which is looking more at policy and urbanism, sort of the intersection of the two, along with Tim Bunnell, who's written a couple of other pieces on, again, also actually policy mimicry from Singapore and to Hyderabad. And so the Tim Bunnell and Diganta Das, I would say, have some really interesting work in that regard. And Ishan, did you have a paper? You had a paper in IJR, right? I really enjoyed reading that. Yeah, no, I was just sort of making that connection just now.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes, I did. It was on Nishad workers,
Yeah.
Nishad boatmen in Banaras.
That was great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank
I think Chetna has a question. She has messaged it in the box. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read it out?
No, I can read it out. And so the question of caste definitely came up even the time that I was getting the paper reviewed. And there's a sad little end note that I have in the paper where I say that it's not a question that came up in my interviews, which is not to say that it's not like relevant. It's just that I think because of the way I was asking the questions and what I was focusing on, caste did not quite emerge in that direct way. Now, the thing that I think would be very interesting to study in the future is who's filling up the potholes, right? And what kinds of labors are involved in the tinkering and wounding and repair of these roads, especially in the municipal corporation. What are the kinds of caste hierarchies when it comes to the kind of work that municipal corporation is doing? And I think that would be a very, very interesting study again. I hope to continue this line of inquiry in Hyderabad. I'm currently distracted by a project in Singapore. Not distracted, I shouldn't say that. I like the project. It's on transport enthusiasm and bus fans and people who love buses, and it's all sorts of deviant pleasures in that sense. But if I were to redo the project, I would focus on this question of caste through this lens. I think there is a more obvious way in which caste would appear in looking at motorists, right? But I think that a more interesting way of thinking about caste and infrastructure could also appear in terms of who's doing the labor of maintaining infrastructures, right? And how is that shaped by caste logics in the city? So I will say, yeah, I will say that in response.
We can take any more questions if we have. Anybody who wants to ask a question can type it out in the chat box. Or if not, then we can bring the session to a close. Usually our sessions last for about an hour or so, but I'm glad that we exceeded this one. It was really lovely speaking to you, Dr. Sneha. And since we had two discussants this time, generally we only have one. There was a lot more insights and questions that came up. I don't think there are any more questions. Thank you so much for such an enlightening talk. We would love to read the book when it comes, and also engage with your work on Singapore, where you're working on tourism and the excitement of buses, which is a very interesting topic for me as well. Thank you so much for the talk. Thank you to our discussants for sharing their insights and the deeply engaging intersectional questions that they asked. I would also like to thank all the participants for their patience, for listening to the talk and engaging with it. Now we will see you next Saturday around the same time. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for organizing this, Ishan and Vedal, for your great comments and questions. And yeah, like just it's really nice to revisit this after the paper has been published, and I feel less, defensive in some ways. So I'm like able to sort of open it up to other domains in that sense. But yeah, thank you so much, and hope you all have a great Saturday. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sneha.
Bye.
Thank you.